mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division. And I'll be the moderator for today's webcast. Today is Friday, August 7th, and we will hear the presentation Beyond Tweeting, Impactful Community Engagement. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown in bold. For your content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box, also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thanks to all of the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. And today's sponsor is the Wisconsin chapter. To learn more about all of our chapters, visit planning.org/chapters, and to learn about the divisions, planning.org/divisions. To learn about today's sponsor, visit wisconsinplanners.org. On your screen now is a list of the rest of our upcoming webcasts for August. To register for these webcasts and webcasts for the rest of the season, visit ohioplanning.org/planningwebcasts. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, go to planning.org, go to your dashboard, select activities by provider. Again, today's sponsor is the Wisconsin chapter, and then select today's title. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some of our recorded webcasts are available for distance education CM credit. For availability of our distance education credits, check our webcast webpage again at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. And we are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will be available after the presentation on our webcast webpage at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. I'd now like to introduce today's speaker, Nick Bowden. Nick believes that communities can only be as strong as the relationships between the people and places in them. With a background in urban planning, he approaches civic technology from a vastly different perspective than others in the industry. Prior to My Sidewalk, Nick spent time as an urban planner at various firms, including Olson Associates, where he met My Sidewalk co-founder Nathan Preheim. In 2009, Nick started his own urban planning and consulting firm, Community Redesigned. While also continuing to work on the My Sidewalk concept, Nick grew the new firm over the next 2 years and was ultimately acquired in late 2011. The timing of the acquisition gave Nick the break he needed to move over to My Sidewalk full-time. Nick has been named Innovator of the Year by the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, Executive of the Year, and Entrepreneur of the Year by Silicon Prairie News, as well as a Forbes magazine up-and-comer. With that, I am going to turn it over to our speaker, Nick Bowden.
Thank you very much, and it's good and exciting to be with the group today. So I will share my screen here, and then we'll get into to presentation mode. So excited to share, and I'm sure there's some folks that may be familiar with some of our work but we'll cover a variety of different things. So obviously, just as a starting point, we'll talk about impactful community engagement. So just as a little, in the way of background, a little bit about us. A lot of people know us as Mind Mixer, recently rebranded to My Sidewalk, but we've spent close to the last 5 years kind of squarely in the online engagement space, the virtual kind of town hall space, so to speak. We've worked with about 1,800 public organizations and private consulting firms on public projects across the U.S. and Canada, and had just shy of 3 million kind of participants come through various virtual town halls or online engagement portals for a variety and different scopes and scales of projects all across. And probably the important takeaway from here, this slide, is more that we've learned a great deal about what works when it comes to online engagement, probably even learn more about what doesn't work, and try to share as much of that as we can back with the folks that are on the ground doing a lot of this work. So I start with, in terms of engagement, a little bit of a high level kind of what's the current situation, so to speak, look like when it comes to engagement. So we'll talk about engagement kind of in an online and an offline and how the two blend together, but there are three probably primary things to consider and think about when it comes to the engagement environment. The first is stakeholder differences are very stark from even 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. So we'll spend a little bit of time just talking about generational differences, expectations within those generations, and how that impacts the way that we think about engagement and ultimately the way that we go about doing engagement. As most of the folks probably in the call can relate to, there's a theory of using technology in your engagement efforts, and there's the reality of it. A famous line in our office is that just because you buy a new iPhone doesn't mean more people call you. And that probably applies to using technology in an engagement context. Just because you put up or utilize online engagement, whether that's a Twitter handle or Facebook or you know, a specific kind of engagement portal, doesn't mean people just show up, right? So what you put into it is oftentimes reflected in what you get out of it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then ultimately, as someone spent, you know, about a decade kind of in the public sector and private sector and planning and consulting before starting and kind of moving to the technology side of this, we all approach projects with a variety of different biases about the communities that we're about to work in or are working in, about how we're going to run our engagement efforts, about how that's going to be impacted. And so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how sometimes those biases and that thin slicing that we do about a community can actually be correct, right, and help us save time. But there are many instances where that bias actually may prevent you from getting better engagement or more engagement or deeper engagement. So we'll spend a little bit of time on these three kind of weave throughout the presentation here. So I mentioned this kind of evolving stakeholder. So just a few numbers to share with the folks on the call here. So for the first time ever this year, millennials outnumber boomers, right? And this is a significant shift in both communication expectations and how people engage, and frankly in interest and living conditions, et cetera, right? So you've got a variety of different trends and movements, from people moving back into urban areas, from people, you know, home ownership declining at the fastest rate it's ever declined. Car ownership among younger folks is at some of the lowest rates it's ever been. So a lot of those things impact people's interests, the way people engage, and the way they get involved in their respective communities. The second part of this is really interesting. Within the millennial generation, 44% of that generation is of minority ethnic group and or race. Within the boomers, right, that's about half or just less than half of that. So this is a much more diverse generation than prior generations, and that certainly impacts the way that we think about multilingual engagement, impacts the way that we think about different expectations within a culture or within a particular ethnic group about how they want to be engaged and their trust in an engagement process and how that manifests itself in them either getting engaged or not getting engaged. And then lastly, for the first time ever, the youngest age cohort, 5 and under, the majority has now become a minority, right? And so by 2020, the age cohort under 18, right, the majority will be the minority, and then by 2044, they'll actually flip entirely for the entire population. So if you think about the projects you're working on, a lot of planning projects tend to be longer term in nature. 2020 is, you know, right around the corner, right? And 2044, you're thinking about long-term development, impactful development plans or comprehensive plans inside of communities, and when those start to really manifest, when they really start to show up, that's going to be about that time frame. So as we think about everything from land use to aesthetic to the use of transit to how we think about bringing different cultures together in different environments, these are really, really, really interesting stats to think about. But engagement and communication obviously have profound impacts. These stats on how we think about go about that work. And the second part of this, and if anyone has ever heard us talk or seen us talk, it's a familiar slide in some respects. So the University of Texas, San Antonio, I believe, and a variety of other people have done studies around this now, a couple of years back, looked at some of this work, and obviously Robert Putman from Bowling Alone and some others have gone deeply into this kind of phenomenon and this changing the way that we engage. So 9 people on average attend in-person public meetings, right? So it's not an uncommon thing to hear. I see the same 10 people at all my meetings. You see the same 9 people at all your meetings, right? Because those 9 people on average come to lots of different meetings. Half of this country has actually never attended an in-person public meeting. So when we say an in-person meeting, you're a public meeting related to either a government entity or a public agency or school district or otherwise. And approximately, as a country, we spend about $1 billion on in-person public meetings in the course of a calendar year. And so that's profound, right? And that's a really big number, and it's a really high-level resource to allocate to something that has proven out, at least most recently, to not be as effective as it was, say, 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, when the development of our neighborhoods, the make of our neighborhoods, lent itself to a different kind of a process of getting people involved. So if you thought about this purely from an economic standpoint or a cost of acquisition standpoint, it's not uncommon that a public meeting might, in its entirety, both in kind and time and direct costs, maybe be $10,000. By the time you bring a consultant or staff kind of staffs that meeting, you're getting 10 people. In the world of technology, think about the cost of acquisition of a participant, and that's effectively handing out $1,000 bills, right, for people to come to that particular meeting. And so that's a high cost of acquisition when we think about what that entails. So just a consideration to think about how we allocate resources. So I think in the 60s and 70s, you see at the bottom of the slide here, William Riker and Peter Oderschuk were economists that started to look at the economics and the psychology behind voting and civic engagement. Most recently, Anthea Watson from Google.org, Google Civic Group, kind of brought this back to life and called it the calculus of civic engagement. I think it's really fascinating to think about. So I'll walk through the equation here, but I challenge groups to think about how this applies to the work that you do. So the probability that the participant or the citizen will impact the outcome of any civic decision is the P in this equation, right? The benefit, B, of that changed outcome to that individual, right, plus their sense of civic duty has to outweigh the cost of that civic action, right? So in order for this equation to work, obviously the left side has to be greater than the right side, and working means showing up, getting involved, being a part of that process. So I'll walk you through just a couple of scenarios here. Let's look at voting or think about kind of turnout in local elections. So over the last 3 years, there's been a lot of news around this. Voter turnout in municipal or mayoral elections is at an all-time low. So where we're at in Kansas City, I think about 12%, 11% of the population turned out in the most recent mayoral election. LA had one of the lowest, actually their lowest turnout in history, but one of the lowest turnouts ever on record for the city of their size. And if you looked at voting, right, historically, or we walk through the calculus here, the probability that a participant will impact the outcome in a local election, right, 0 or near 0. So for all intents and purposes, unless you're in a very small town, there's only 10 people voting, the likelihood that you will, as an individual, impact an election is really, really low. So that the P and the B is effectively 0 just because you can't multiply by 0, or if it's not 0, it's very, very close. So when it comes to elections, really, right, the sense of civic duty has to outweigh the cost. And the cost in the case of an election is I have to be, if I want to do research before and be an informed voter, I've got to do that. I've got to drive, physically go to a polling place. I've got to fill out the ballot. Then I've got to drive back, right? And that's a relatively costly experience when you consider that if I go to an airport for an airline, I can pull up my phone and I can swipe it under the security thing and walk right in. I don't have to do any pre-work, right? I don't have to do any prep. I don't have to print anything. And a lot of our technology just broadly in the civic space hasn't caught up with some of the stuff you see in the enterprise world. Now, if you think about this from a public meeting perspective, the probability that a participant will impact the decision in a public meeting, there's actually a little bit of inverse psychology that's at play here. If only 9 people come to an average public meeting, there's actually a strange incentive to not have more people come for the 9 people that show up to every meeting, because the more people that show up actually reduce, right, the probability that participant will impact that outcome. And so while probably not a conscious consideration that we all think about in engagement, that's actually a reality. The more people that get involved, the less that any individual, right, in theory, can overtake that process. Is that a benefit of any public meeting to an individual outcome? Maybe if it's something in my backyard or something on my street, me changing that outcome or altering that outcome to benefit me, but probably in a sense, right, still relatively low, that the P and the B part of this adds up for a public meeting. And ultimately, we're back to the same thing on the voting side, right? Does my sense of civic duty ultimately outweigh the cost of that? So for the better part of the last 5 years, most of the effort and the introduction of technology into this space has focused purely on the C of the equation, right? So how do we reduce the cost of participation by making it available online? So how do we increase the convenience factor, reduce the cost factor, and then in sense, we hope that the cost becomes low enough that the right side of this equation is less than the left side of the equation. I contend that as technology has matured, and as online tools and platforms have matured in this space, that we as a group need to really shift our focus to think about how do we actually start to instill the left side of this. So how do we communicate effectively the participant, the probability and the benefit participant, and how do we make sure that we continue to communicate civic duties? There's a famous study that was done, the Obama campaign in 2012. One of the things that they did is they sent postcards to folks that voted in 2008 and said, thank you for voting in 2008. We hope to see you at the polls again. We really appreciate your the fact that you carried out your civic duty, right? So they just reminded them that civic duty was very important. And it turns out the sample set that got those postcards voted at a much higher rate than those folks that didn't get the postcards. So just consider this equation. You think about it. This actually probably applies to more than just civic engagement, of course, but it's an interesting thing to think about as you plan your engagement efforts. So Google's done some really interesting work around this. You see at the bottom again, there's a technical paper on this, but basically a recent study looked at the disposition of the population. So what are the civic profiles in the United States, and how does that impact people's willingness to get involved? And you see this spectrum from the community active group, the most engaged, all the way to the civically disconnected, the least engaged, right? So everybody, as you're looking at this, of course, can probably think back to a project where you had a variety of different folks in different places. So if you took out effectively, right, the civically disconnected and the absentees from the right side of this, and then you looked at, it took out the kind of the community active, the people that are very, very active, and you really focused on kind of the middle part of this spectrum, right, which is the neighborhood advocates, the vocal opinionators, the issue aware, and the absentees. What kind of Google surmised in the research was really what you end up with is you end up with a lot of interested bystanders. So people that are civically aware, right, they understand what's happening inside of their community, but they're actually in fact not civically active, right? So that's an interesting thing to consider when we think about increasing engagement in a process, which is how do we identify those folks that actually do follow along, right? So they take in Twitter activity, or they read their local newspaper online, or they're involved in some way in their community, but generally speaking, right, their formal civic involvement, whether that be showing up to public meetings or voting, actually isn't there. And I'd contend, I think a lot of the things that we do and think about in our work is how do we actually tap back into a group that doesn't need to be convinced that they should be aware that's going on, but just needs that push over the edge to say you should be and you can be involved. And I think this really, in combination with the calculus of civic engagement, gives you a really good sense of how you might think about getting those folks involved. So just some background research around some of the personas and the stakeholders, but also kind of just how technology fits into some of this. So I don't know if these probably aren't simple rules necessarily, because I don't know if you can have simple and impactful to some degree in the same sense. To some degree, engagement is a little bit of a contact sport, right? So you've actually got to get people involved. You've got to make an effort to get people involved. But we've distilled down some of our work into some things that we think are tidbits that can help you out. So the first is know your audience. This is seems really obvious, right? Like, of course, I have to know my audience before I go out to talk to those people. We live in a world now where our access or ability to get data about who we're wanting to engage or who we want to be involved in a process is probably at an all-time high, right? So the ability to access data in a lot of different formats, a lot of different platforms is really, really much more accessible than it's ever been, right? And I think it's probably no longer a viable excuse to not know who you want to reach and how you want to reach them and how you're going to target your engagement efforts, because a lot of the stuff is available in ways that it wasn't before. And so an example here, and I'll tie in some of the bias, you're looking at a map of downtown Kansas City where we're at. And the map, the chloropleth of the map is looking at total voter turnout per capita, right? So the darker splotches on the map are places where the per capita voting turnout in the last election was really high. You see the charts on the right side. So most of this data actually comes from all the charts on the right side. It's just census data, right, at the block group level. The voter turnout and the population data comes from a variety of public sources. This happens to just be visualized in a way. So if I was working on a project in downtown Kansas City, I may say as one of my biases that I'd like to be able to target folks that showed up in the last election. They seem like a group of people that would absolutely be involved in a project. Now, if I stop there, right, I might have a bias, or I might say, you know what, I bet people that have higher education and are employed are most likely to vote. So if I don't have voting data, I'm going to target neighborhoods that, you know, generally have higher educational attainment and are employed, because my theory is if you own a home and you're employed and you have education, then that means you're more likely to be informed, and that means you're more likely to be involved. Well, it turns out in downtown Kansas City, the block group that has the highest voter turnout per capita doesn't have a single bachelor's degree in that block group, and 40% of the people approximately that live in that block group are unemployed, right? So if I had carried my bias and not gone all the way through to know who my audience was and who I was trying to reach, I may have stopped and entirely missed a fantastic opportunity to tap into a group of people that clearly, from a voting perspective, have shown a disposition to be involved and care about their community. There's a lot of reasons that could be the case, but this is just one of those things where you both see how you might think about an audience, but also see how, in my case, the bias I explained actually might prevent me from reaching those folks. So the second example here is, now we're looking at Omaha, where I grew up. This map is showing total population under the age of 20, right? So census data again, and then the dots on the map are colleges and universities. So if I wanted, or I was working on a project in Omaha and I said, you know, I really want to reach young people, right? I want to make sure that I get in front of those folks that are the next generation that are going to consume a lot of what we design or what we build or what we plan out. This is actually a really easy way to go, okay, here are the local universities and colleges in town based on the points on the map. And by block group again, right, the darker place are people that under the age of 20 live. And so that might mean two things. It means I might hold a public meeting in a place that has a really high concentration of young people, and really get out the word and effort, partner with the universities or colleges to say, how do we get young people involved in our process? Or conversely, if I'm using social media or another online platform to get people involved, I might use this data to target those folks through very specific or contextual advertising on an online platform, through very specific and contextual tagging of geographic content. But this just gives you a sense, right? And there are a lot of different ways to get this data. Census obviously provides a lot of this, and the ability to use it, whether it's in your GIS system, whether it's in this case our platform, other platforms, has become easier and easier every single year as more and more data gets released. So kind of the first rule for impactful engagement is you have to know your audience. Now this could go the other way too, right? I could pull up a map that says, I want to make sure that we reach older populations and lower income populations. So I'm going to use that data to make sure that I put my offline meetings in places that may not have the same amount of access to technology or online or awareness. And I'm going to really maximize my resources to get those folks involved in my offline efforts. So the data can be used both in a way to target specific demographic groups, specific age groups, or specific cohorts of folks that live in a particular community. So the second kind of component of this is to tell a story. So urban designers and planners and landscape architects are probably the best of any profession kind of in this space at visual communication, right? And I can think about a variety of different projects that I've been involved in or had the opportunity to work on over the course of many years. And when we were able to tell a story, and we were able to tell that story articulately and communicate that with a lot of visuals or graphics or data, those projects, right, always end up in a better place than when we can't, you know, kind of clearly articulate that particular story that we're trying to tell. So telling a story doesn't necessarily mean influencing decision. It just means leveraging, right, some of the resources you have, whether it be data or otherwise, to be able to do that. So I'm going to show you an example. City of West Hollywood. There may be some folks here are created a transportation view or dashboard. This happens to be an example just inside of our product where they can actually share this with the general public or with other folks or with the consultant, where they can see, okay, by block group in our community, looking at total population, the red dots are transit stops. So as an end citizen, I can actually come on, right, scroll over the map, and I can actually see where are transit stops and what's the commute type of people that live in that particular area. In this case, what's the number of vehicles per household. So this is a very different kind of way to communicate and create a baseline of information among citizens when you're working on a project. I can't tell you the number of times, and I'm sure that the folks that are listening probably think at least of one or two, where you're working on a project where the general population may have really no inclination or no idea what are the contributing factors to actually making a suggestion for implementation. So the classic story is like the older, nicer neighborhood, and a developer wants to come in, and that developer wants to put in a mixed-use 5-story market-rate apartment complex, right? And an older neighborhood says, no way, we don't want that. Renters bring riffraff. Well, you may find out that that neighborhood, in fact, is actually 40% rental or 35% rental, but the people that showed up at the meeting were homeowners. They just assumed that everybody else in that neighborhood was a homeowner. And so if you can't properly and articulately tell that story that says, your neighborhood is actually made up of quite a few renters, right? These are the other attributes or demographics that we should, as a community, consider when we think about a potential redevelopment. Now, if we all agree on the factual side of the data, let's talk about what the impacts are of this particular development, the transportation impacts, the traffic impacts, the design aesthetic or the quality of the design become really important parts of that discussion. In so many projects, it feels like either have the potential to or get off track through a narrative that probably actually isn't reflective of the underlying data in that community, and finding tools, whether they be visuals or visualizing data to be able to communicate those things and tell that story becomes really, really important, especially in a world where so much information within that millennial kind of population group is being consumed from a phone on the move with very little time to actually dig in and think about it and do some research. So being able to provide snippets of information, tell that story in little kind of snippets that allow people to consume it in parts and then kind of collect the whole becomes a really important facet of doing impactful engagement. So go back to the presentation here. So the third rule here is you got to talk like a citizen. So we actually we found out how hard it is, right? And I'm a planner and come from a planning background, so I can say some of these things. But we have a tendency in the profession to talk in very technical or planner-esque terms or design-esque terms, and we never really thought about it as a company until we put in multilingual components to our platform. And so we allowed for folks in different languages, of course, to be able to participate. And when our clients that were planners wrote up questions or descriptions, and then they translated, they actually don't translate very well to any other language because most of that language is pretty technical, right? It actually doesn't have a parallel or a equivalent word in almost every other language to actually translate to. And so that really forced us to say, let's dig in and just see how impactful different things are when it comes to language. And what we learned was quite interesting. So we've been working with both MIT and the University of Nebraska the last couple of years to really dive into the sentiment of how words impact an engagement process. So first and foremost, descriptive words, so articulately worded topic descriptions, in our case the description of a question, actually enjoy a much greater response rate. And so things that help the general public or help other folks understand exactly what we're doing, why the project's important, and really help them understand what's intended to be accomplished with that particular question, that particular project, actually results in more, right, or more successful engagement than otherwise. So you see on the left side or the vertical axis there, instances of words in a topic. So the number of words, right, actually has a positive correlation in the description with the success of that particular engagement effort. And success being measured in number of responses, the depth of engagement, and the length of engagement within a particular person. And so you see a little dip actually. So when you have a medium number of words, right, 40 in a description, it's actually lower than on the poor side when it's 60. So actually pushing that up and allowing people to understand what's going on and why that question is important becomes really, really relevant. The second part, not terribly surprising, but worth sharing. So attitude begets attitude is probably a good thing to think about. So if you are positive and you use words of achievement in your descriptions and how you present in an offline meeting and how you present questions in an offline meeting, not surprisingly, that positive and that achievement attitude actually begets the same kind of attitude in your participants. So the use of positive words like best and great and proud, right, or the use of advance or overcome have a really positive impact and a positive correlation with people's willingness to be engaged and stay engaged and contribute back to a conversation. And so this is a really important thing, and I always give the example, and I'll go to the next slide here, because not surprisingly, inhibitive words or exclusive words have the inverse impact, right? So less success is used when you use things like stop, block, constrain, not, rather, and less versus. So there's two ways to ask a question, right? And I use the example of let's say we're working on a downtown master plan, just for lack of a better project. But there's one way to ask a question that says, so let's just say there's behavior going on in downtown that isn't ideal, and we want to make sure that the plan addresses some of that behavior. So one way to ask that question would be to say, how do we stop bad behavior in downtown, right? So that's a lot of inhibitive words, a lot of exclusive words. How do we stop other people from doing a certain behavior? Now the other way to ask that question might be, how do we make sure that downtown encourages the right kind of behavior among the entire population? So both get you to the same outcome, right? But very much present that outcome in a very different way. And it's surprising, maybe even it seems, is just the small use a couple of those words absolutely impacts what people hear and how they think about the context of that particular project. So really, really important to keep in mind, either when you're presenting in an offline setting and or presenting in an online setting. So personal affiliations, right? We words, so things that we solve these problems together. And you see the quote actually from one of our clients, right? This is not somebody else's problem, this is our own problem. That's very much a, we're going to solve this together. I can tell you when I was working as a consultant, we go in and do a project in a particular community, there were times when probably unconsciously, right, we think about we are helping them plan their community, right? We don't live here, we don't have a dog in the fight, so we're helping you plan your community. And then when it comes from elected officials and or staff, oftentimes they actually take that same tone. We're going to help you be, as community members, plan the community. And the example I always give here is a sports analogy, which is, if you're not a sports fan, I apologize, but if you are, it's hard to get it. So when your team loses, right, if you're a college football fan, on Sunday they'll say they lost, right? When the team wins, everybody wins. We won. And I think that's probably the same thing here, which is how do we make sure that we're in this together, whether it's consultants and community or community and citizens, when we think about our engagement efforts, we think about how we talk in those efforts. So not surprisingly, people want to feel like they're being heard. This goes back to the equation, right, the calculus of engagement. If I don't understand or I don't have acknowledgement, my ability to understand how I can impact an outcome in a positive way or how I see benefit in my participation is really, really limited. And so these are two active platforms that we saw and measured. The active acknowledgement, so just simply saying thank you for your engagement, thanks for being involved, we're really glad that you're here, we're really glad that you're contributing, has a profound impact on the trend line of engagement over the course of a project. So in one of these, you're looking at a 6-month, or both of these, you're looking at a 6-month period of time. And the trend line, right, on the one on the left, where there's active acknowledgement, actually goes up significantly, right? So it starts at kind of lower levels, take the spikes out of the anomalies in engagement, and that trend line starts to actually creep up at the 6-month mark. And in most projects, by the time you get to 6, 7, 8, 9 months, even if you're doing entirely offline, the crowds have diminished significantly unless you get to, let's say, a council meeting that's a really controversial kind of implementation plan. So I think it's so important, and this is really a cycle, either a positive cycle or a negative cycle of feedback. If you provide people feedback, right, it actually allows them to say, you know what, maybe I don't agree with this, or maybe I do agree with it, but the fact that they're acknowledging that I'm involved is really important. I'm going to continue to stay involved. Now, if you don't, right, it has the same kind of consequence. I went to a meeting, it didn't really feel like they cared what I said. They just kind of checked off the box. There's really no reason for me to come back to a meeting or come back online. That cycle is going to feed itself as well. And so this is something that I think oftentimes gets lost in a process, lost in a project, of just the act of saying thank you. The example I give is, just think about an offline conversation. Imagine if you were having a conversation with someone, and I was sitting there talking to this person, and they just absolutely didn't acknowledge anything I was saying. They're just kind of staring at me blankly. The likeliness that I continue to engage that person is pretty low. Right? That's a very specific example, but just one that highlights some of how this works. So the ability to continue to get people to be involved is highly correlated with your acknowledgement of their presence, but also the acknowledgement of the ideas. So the last kind of piece of this, before we get into some questions and some discussion here, is you got to be accessible, right? So accessibility touches lots of different parts of the process. So I contend that in today's day and age, obviously accessible can mean making sure that you have accessible public meeting locations, right? Making sure that you're reaching all parts of the population, that you're intending or making an effort to get a representation of the entire community. But I would also say that accessible means you have to be online, right? I don't think in this day and age in 2015 that if you're working on a project, even if it's short in scope, even if it doesn't have a huge effort, that you cannot be online in that effort, because so much of the population spends their time there. So this is from Pew's Internet Research. It's actually not, I'll actually give you some updated stats on the fly here. 89% of American adults use the web at least weekly or monthly, right? So 9 out of 10, nearly 9 out of 10 people in this country are actively using the web to get information, to share information. Of the remaining 11% that's not, I think about 7% of those people entirely refuse to use the internet for their entire livelihood or their entire life. So they're not going to be online no matter how accessible it is how they report in the surveys. And so our ability to use online tools to reach 90% of people is much different than our ability to use offline tools, right, in some respects, to reach 9 people on average. And so how we think about allocation of resources become a really important thing. The most common thing we heard when we started about 5 years ago was, yeah, that's great, we want to be online, we should be online, but online tools are never going to reach older people, and they're never going to reach lower income areas. And digital divide was absolutely a real thing 5 or 6 years ago. I don't think that, as you can see in some of these stats, I actually don't think the digital divide is probably as real as it was, let's say, 5, 10 years ago. I absolutely think that there is an information divide, right, that lives within lower income communities, that lives within rural communities, in some cases, that lives within older populations, where they may have technology, they may have a smartphone, right, they may have access to the internet, that could be through a public library, that could be through the home, but, right, they don't have free time, right, they don't have a bunch of extra time to be involved. They probably don't operate in the same information circles that a lot of these folks do. And so if you think about a lower income family and having to really the only thing they can consider is making ends meet, right? Their ability, whether they have a phone or not, to get involved in a project is going to be, or be informed about what's going on, is oftentimes going to be difficult, because in most instances, wealth and or education begets an extra bit of free time, which begets the ability to actually understand or be more informed, right? So those things absolutely relate to each other. And so you see the last stat here, about 80% of households actually under 30K per year in median household income are using the web. There are ways and contextual ways to reach those folks that are not the same way that you'd reach, right, the higher income folks that have, let's say, 100% internet usage or adoption, right? And I think that's most profoundly actually in both the distribution channel, in the context of that distribution, and the language that you use. And so we work with the city of Los Angeles on a transportation plan. And one of the things that they did, which I thought was brilliantly done, was utilize text messaging to get engagement, but they put big posters in the bus stop, and you had a phone number that you could text in or take a survey with, and then that all fed back into our platform. So all of the engagement came back together. But in that case, that's very contextual, right? So they're looking for feedback on the bus system, so it's happening in the bus stop. It allows for you to use a device, right, a technological device, but you don't have to have an internet browser, you don't have to have a smartphone. You can text in. And it also puts it really that question of like, how do we get you from point A to point B more effectively is a question that everybody can answer, right? So within a process, think about it like a transportation master plan. There are questions like, how do we want our community to look like in 20 years from a transit perspective? That question really only can be answered by people that can live in that kind of conceptual world where they can freely imagine 20 years from now, I'm going to have children, they're going to be this old, they're going to be doing these kinds of things. How would I want my community to look? A family that's living week to week or day to day, their ability to imagine 20 years out is really severely limited, right? So if you compound that problem with, you're not accessible, you're only one-dimensional in your approach, you're using poor language, and it's not contextual, you're going to lose a lot of people regardless, right, if those people are online or not. So I always mention that just as you have to be online, but you also have to understand how to use both online and offline tools in your approach to make sure you get as many people as possible. So with that said, I think we're going to take some questions.
Great, thank you. So everyone go ahead and start asking those questions. I know it's Friday afternoon for, well, at least half of us. While we start getting some questions in, I guess I'm personally curious why the shift from Mind Mixer to My Sidewalk. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's just me being curious.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think there were two big themes. Mind Mixer was very much a project-specific, community-specific platform where everybody kind of had their own place to do those things. And what we saw was that citizens are multifaceted or multidimensional in their interest. And so we would have communities where we had 75 or 100 Mind Mixer sites in one metro area. Some would be with a school district, or some would be with a city or a county. And about half of our participants were actually participating on more than one Mind Mixer site, using the same login, but actually contributing to multiple places. And it seems silly that we would continue to force them to kind of go between URLs. So one component was My Sidewalk lets the citizen kind of be the focal point, and we can actually deliver both geographic and interest-based notifications so they can make sure that they know that everything's going on. So that's the first piece. The second piece, though, is that a lot of our organizations that we're working with are asking us, can we use demographic data, can we use socioeconomic data to either better understand who our participants are and or better understand how we can target certain groups of people. And so those things are intrinsically linked, right? If I'm wealthier neighborhoods have very different interests, they're engaged in different ways. Say poor neighborhoods, denser neighborhoods engage in different ways than large lot neighborhoods. And so bringing some of that into our process and some of that into our product is really, I think, designed to help people reach different audiences more effectively. And then obviously the ability to communicate that kind of data and really kind of have an end-to-end engagement platform that allows you to take a lot of the work that you're doing on the data side and then transfer that into the communication side seamlessly is something that we had a lot of interest in. So those are the kind of the three primary reasons for making the shift.
Okay, thank you. What would the cost be to do an online community survey for a small community, say a population of 1,800?
That's a really good question. So in our case, we actually have everything from, we have a free version up to something that's more comprehensive in the use of data and the use of targeting and the use of kind of the demographic shared stuff. So a lot of our small communities, really small rural communities, actually use the free version, which is an engagement profile that lets you do a lot of the feedback loop. And then we've got some of the bigger cities that we work with, or even small cities that want to really dive into some of the data that they're on kind of our paid version. So we've got everything from free to $15,000 to $25,000 per year based on how much of it you want to utilize.
Okay, great. Okay, this question comes from Donald. Okay, Donald says, I do a lot of work with DOTs. They are still insisting that public open houses are part of the process, which is fine. What is an interactive process that you have used or are aware of to better engage people within the space of a public meeting to broaden the audience for transportation projects?
That's a really good question. So we work with about 15 DOTs, I think. So North Carolina DOT is something that we work pretty close with. They do a really good job of blending the two together. And so They're still using public open houses and public meetings. They're trying to do a better job of targeting those to specific areas. They can get a kind of a maximum return on some of those efforts. But I think, you can, in some instances, we've actually seen organizations that will bring iPads into a public meeting or use phones, mobile browsers. Or in our case, we have an app, a native app that people can use where they're actually, instead of asking people that come to the meeting to write things down, they're actually either providing devices or asking them to use their own devices. And the benefit of that is, one, you introduce the platform to people in the meeting, so when they go home, they know there's a way to continue to be engaged online. And two, you can actually, on a projector or on a big screen, actually pull up some of the live content that's coming in from a particular place. And so that's, in the case of our platform, that's one way. I've also seen, though, I think it's probably really effective if you're with the right crowd, just having people that'll establish like a unique hashtag. And so it might be like DOT Raleigh project, right? And they'll ask people to use Twitter, and then they'll just sort, right, their Twitter stream based on that hashtag, and they'll actually have people tweet in comments, feedbacks. Now the challenge of that, of course, is that Twitter doesn't make it easy to pull that out in a raw format, but at very least it allows you to take advantage of some of the way that Twitter is set up with the tools they have. And so those are a couple of different ideas, at least the things that we've seen that have worked really well. But there's a lot of DOTs that we work with too that do a really good job of trying to use both. Sometimes they use them a little bit independent of each other, but there are some that do a really good job of merging the two together.
Thank you. And I just thought of something related to what you just said for public meetings to sort of integrate the two. And this might be a really silly question, and I don't know, but is it possible to do things like rent iPads or tablets for meetings? If you're an organization, a nonprofit, or even a municipality, and you don't just happen to have 20 iPads on you, are there companies out there where you can rent these things that you know of?
You know what? I don't. That's a good question. I don't know, but I do know that in those cases, so we've actually mailed out iPads before to people, just because we have a lot in our office that we do testing on. That's probably not something that we would do very often, but we have. But if you thought about the meeting location, so you could have it in the library, you could have it in the community center, you could have it at places that already have some of that there to take advantage of. That's probably a possibility as well.
Or that's just my $1 million idea that I just told 300 people that they're going to come up with now. Okay, next question.
Nobody steal that idea.
Yeah, okay. It's mine. All right. I have 300 investors on my hand. Our community is currently struggling with citizens who repeatedly state they are not receiving adequate notification about our public hearings. We send postcards to those affected and post it online on our planning webpage. What suggestions do you have to better notify citizens in an attempt to get the most participation? The age-old question.
Yeah, this is, so I don't want to get too much on the soapbox here, but I think I'll mention that we have we have a communication infrastructure in public agency that is so antiquated, right? And is very, very kind of traditional, or even in some respects very old school in how we think about notifying people. And I just think about, so someone that is, I'm in my young 30s, have a young family. When we get mail, right, I can't tell you the last time that I sorted through mail, and I think we maybe grab our mail once a week or once every week and a half, maybe when the mailbox is full. And I'm speaking for myself, and I don't want to cast like complete generalizations about everybody that's my age, but you think about how much that's changed in some respects, but yet most of our processes require that we still do a lot of the notifications that we've done previously. It's a tough one, and I think it's something that we deal with a lot of times, which is the citizens, I think, generally will always say they don't feel notified enough. I think we've got a little bit of a vending machine kind of culture around government, which is like, do what I need you to do when I need you to do it, but otherwise I don't actually expect to have to give anything back, which I think is a really difficult thing to kind of work through. I would tell you that in my opinion, one of the things that we're seeing more and more communities do is try to collect email addresses at every opportunity possibly can, whether that's through your website, whether that's through an email form, whether that's even at public meetings, because it just gives you a digital touch point to allow for you to touch them in multiple ways. So like in advertising, the age-old rule is someone has to hear something 7 times, right, before it actually registers. And so if you thought about, one postcard, one posting on city websites don't get a ton of traffic, right, comparatively to email or comparatively to social tools. And so I'd say trying to utilize and leverage everything from a Facebook page and a Twitter feed and an email campaign, and then even obviously continue to do postcards, I think is the best bet there. But I think trying to identify and collect as many digital touch points as you can becomes a really important thing. The one thing I will say, though, that we have seen in a couple cities, a lot of cities, if they're bigger and you've got HOAs or you've got homeowner associations or neighborhood groups that do a lot of that, at least in the Kansas City area, a lot of the HOAs have built really good web presences for themselves or neighborhood groups, and a lot of people will check those, right? So they actually check a notification, they'll see something from that. So those become really good conduits to communicate some of this out. The other place that we've seen too is trying to actually get those kinds of things into church announcements and into school backpacks. And so getting something, your kid brings something home, right, in their folder and their backpack, that's a very different kind of thing than, say, get it in the mail or not seeing it otherwise. And so those are just a couple of different ideas and things that we've seen different communities to try to get the word out about different projects.
Okay. Next question. As population increases, the ability to individually influence outcomes decreases. Do you see practical limits to the size of groups which can be engaged to keep the benefits greater than costs of engagement?
It's like the ultimate question around that calculus of engagement, right? And I think I mentioned it, which is like there's actually a built-in motivation for the people that already come to keep that group small, just purely based on odds. I think we should absolutely want as many people to be involved in as many processes as possible. Now that I know that there's a lot of people that probably cringe when I say that, which is like, oh my gosh, do we really want everybody to be involved in every process? I think the calculus is very much about how we go about making the decision to be involved, and I think a little bit less about how that involvement can or should take place. And so I think there are ways, and I mentioned a little bit, technology is really focused on the cost side. There are ways, so consider Facebook, right? I mean, Facebook has 1.4 billion people. The average person on Facebook has hundreds and hundreds of friends. But if you log on to Facebook, or you do log on to Facebook, it feels pretty personal, right? It actually feels like it's your place or your space with your contacts. So despite this massively global network, they've actually done a really good job of making sure that experience feels curated to that particular person. Now, that's obviously, Facebook has endless resources, right, and endless ways to go about that. But if you think about a project, even as the number of people increase, right, allowing people to personalize or contextualize that, I think that's where technology or online engagement probably can lean in and help in a lot different ways than maybe offline, because a public meeting that has 250 people, right, you got to facilitate it in the proper way. You've got to get people involved in a way that actually allows you to keep control of the meeting, right, or a semblance of control of the meeting. And so personalization in that context is really, really difficult unless you're smart about how you group people by geographic cohort or by age cohort, or you want to mix those things together. But in an online context, for us at least, by actually asking people to provide an address as an optional component of signing up, it allows them to tailor and say, I would like to receive notifications of projects that are going on in my area or near me that fit my interest. And there are ways to use online tools, I think, to curate some of that personalization, because that's a perceptual thing, right? Like it's probably more perceptual than actual, in fact, which is, do I perceive that I can impact that outcome in a way that's positive to me? And in actuality, right, there's so many forces at play about how an outcome comes to be. And in many cases, if you looked at it from an actual versus perceptive standpoint, it may not play out. So I'd say that that's probably where, that may not be a great answer, it's probably where online technology can actually lean in and really help try to personalize or curate an experience that feels very, very individual.
Thanks. Next question. What has been your experience in integrating technology with on-the-ground strategic community conversations?
So, really good question. I think I don't know, I should know, but I don't know the consulting firm off the top of my head that does it. But everybody, and maybe haven't heard of, but one of my favorite offline tactics is kind of this intercept survey, right? So, if you're working on a parks master plan, there's no better place, right, in theory and probably in reality, to get feedback than from people that are in a park, right, or people that are using trails. And so you could apply that to a neighborhood planning effort. You could apply that to a geographic specific planning effort. You know, so many times, and it's always been strange, we'll see a geographic specific effort, let's say a neighborhood plan, where like the public meetings will like be at City Hall, that's not in the neighborhood, or they'll be at a place that actually isn't in that location or isn't on the ground. And so there are opportunities to use kind of this intercept survey, so to speak, and that could be paper or digital, where you can actually catch people kind of in the act of walking to the neighborhood or driving to the neighborhood or interacting with a particular part of that neighborhood, that particular park. And that's actually where, you know, technology can save a great deal of time, because if you're writing everything on paper, at some point someone's got to go back and get that into one kind of big document. So you've got like a 2 or 3 step process to actually aggregate that. Whereas even if you're using SurveyMonkey, right, and you've got an iPad and you're doing something on the ground, you can continue to have people go through that, and all of that data is going to end up in one place that can be analyzed. But if you're doing it across different parts, that becomes a little bit harder. And so, you know, text messages are really interesting because the actual amount of text messages sent is going down. And so they peaked like in 2010, and now in-app, so like Facebook Messenger and things like Slack and email and other things are taking the place of a lot of texting, which is just kind of another interesting part of the phenomenon. They had a really good run. I think there's still a lot of use to use SMS and projects, and there are some services out there that actually will provide you an opportunity to use text messages as a part of that engagement effort. And so I think, you know, it's a big question, and that there's a lot of different parts of a on-the-ground kind of strategic communication that could be efficiency around data collection. It could be enabling the use of technology beyond the first interaction. But those are just a few thoughts related to the question. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks. Okay, next question. I was waiting for this question to pop up. Do you have any examples of effective community engagement in multilingual communities?
Yeah, so we've and I can't speak for anybody else. I can speak for some stuff we've done. We've seen some really good examples of multilingual engagement in both Southern California and Texas, and I think in parts of Florida, and I actually think a small community in the Northeast, where I will tell you, if you're using an online platform, and it's not, so there's a difference between like Google Translate and actually internationalized platforms. So Facebook, for example, is internationalized. So you set your language by default, right? So if you're Spanish speaking, if you go on vacation, say Mexico, and you log on to Facebook, it's actually going to show up in Spanish, right? So it's internationalized. And internationalized platforms actually handle all the hard work of translation. They do it really quite well. Google Translate, conversely, for folks that have used it, handles it quite poorly, especially in technical projects or planning projects where you've got a lot of words that are more technical. And so the point of that is, where we've seen successful multilingual engagement efforts, it's when they're using the online platform, but they write the original content in the language that they actually want to reach people. And so if they want to reach Spanish speakers, they actually write that content in Spanish, not in English, let the translate tool do the work. They'll write it in Spanish first, or in Mandarin, like we've seen in Northern California first. And then as people log on, it's not confusing, right? So if their browser, so a lot of non-English speaking folks actually have their browsers defaulted to another language, which a lot of people don't realize you can do, or that people do. And so if your browser is defaulted to, say, Spanish, and something comes up, it's going to ask you if you want it to be translated. And so it'll just use Google Translate to actually make that translation. But if it's written in the original language, the language you're intending, and the translation doesn't occur, and you actually consume that in the exact language. So that's where we've seen the most success in multilingual, at least in the use of online tools. is when the original content's actually written in the language that you're trying to reach. And so they're tough too, right? Because outside of language, oftentimes culturally, there's different trust factors, different ways to reach communities. You know, in some instances, in some of the communities we worked in, the language barrier actually wasn't the barrier. It happened to be one of the attributes of the community that people are trying to reach, but the barrier was actually more of a not wanting to be involved, not comfortable being involved, not having a lot of experience going to public meetings or getting online to be involved with the formal editing. So I think the language has kind of two different facets of an engagement effort. One is obviously the ability to be involved and consume. That's a permission to play kind of element. The second there is the ability to actually feel comfortable being involved.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so somewhat related. So for some of the aging baby boomers who are not as tech savvy, how do we involve them in the public process that might be tech heavy?
So I think it's a really good question. I would tell you in our experience, so it's all relative. I haven't seen a project yet that I would call tech heavy, right? Where like tech is the predominant form of engagement. I mean, there are certainly probably some in some communities. I come from the background, right, about our offline engagement. The best projects we've ever seen and ever been involved in or worked on always combine both efforts, right? They're never either or. It's not either we're just doing online or just doing offline. They're leveraging them together. Some of the work that we've done with MIT actually suggests that there's actually people that move through those. There's a common perception, and actually proving to be probably a misperception, that online people only engage online and offline people only do offline stuff. It actually is the case. Online happens to be in some instances, a nice entry point, a lower barrier entry point into an offline engagement, and then offline gives you the chance we talked about earlier to actually introduce your online tools to the people that show up offline first, and then go, oh, I didn't realize I can also get online. And so I think the best answer to that question is projects should still be very much bivariate in their experience, right, where you're doing both online and offline. You're doing things that are conversational and things that are formal. I think diverse engagement plans and diverse engagement approaches, regardless of even some of the generational side, it yielded the best results in our case in almost every instance that's ever been used. And so for the folks that still don't feel comfortable with technology, who want to be involved, I'd absolutely say you should still offer opportunities to be involved in a non-technical way. And I contend that probably in most cases, you know, getting people, allowing people to involve in a technical way is some of the barrier that we've seen a lot of.
Okay, thank you. One more question, I think. We're seeing that truly addressing issues involves multiple interacting factors. Example, discussing transportation as more than vehicle level of service. Do you have recommendations of places that have effectively addressed the interconnections and kept it understandable to citizens?
Yeah, so that, I mean, that's the tell the story or tell a story kind of lesson here, right? Is that I think it's twofold. So, you know, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the public tends to distill things down to the simplest way to think about something. The simplest way is never never, as the asker of the question pointed out, never actually accurately reflects the complexity of making decisions. And so, you know, as someone that commutes and I have about a 30-minute drive, I understand that it's not simply like wider roads or just simply transit or otherwise to reduce that commute time. Right now, most of my fellow drivers on that commute probably don't understand that, right? They probably think that if we just add another lane, that would be much faster. And the folks in the call know that actually adding another lane is going to add more traffic probably 5 years from now. So finding ways, in that instance, I'm actually a huge proponent of transparency, which is just, here are all the data sets, and you got to present them simply, but here are all the data sets that we're considering that actually impact this, right? So vehicle density per household, right? Road condition, the ability to utilize transit. So I showed that, and I can pull it back up here. I mean, I showed, this is an interesting way, at least in our world, to think about this, which is you're giving, right, a citizen the ability to spend a little bit of their own time actually thinking about, okay, this is the most populous block group, right, in this particular area, it probably makes sense that there's more transit stops in that particular area. But if I look down here at the stats, right, even though there's a lot of transit stops in that particular area, the number of vehicles per household and the commute type, a lot of people still drive along there, right? So this is obviously reflects some of the complexity of this, which is just, you know, you can't just throw more transit stops up and all of a sudden more people ride transit, right? There's the ability to get to a transit stop. And so as you just scroll over some of them, this is just one example for us at least of how we're trying to tackle that problem of how can you actually take some of this data, put it into a way that's consumable from a phone or a browser, and actually allow for citizens to have access to the same kind of information, but not overwhelm them with that kind of information. And you can add a question to a dashboard like this, right? At the bottom of this, you could say, now that you've considered or seen the data that we're looking at, how do you think about transportation in our particular community? And so there are ways to do this using GIS, right? Of course, in visuals, there are ways to do it in public meetings. But I hate to be like the totally negative on this. I think in some respects, right, we've got to be able to work with some of the limited understanding. Obviously, we try our very, very best as professionals in the field to do as much education as we can. But, right, there are still some people that think like cities handle the DMV, and that's probably a county function or a state function, right? And they'll never be able to separate those two things. And so if you know, as a citizen, I think that, you know, the DMV is a city problem, and it may be in some cases, but I think in most cases, the county problem or state problem. The ability to understand the complexities and the intricacies, the relationship in a transit study is probably going to be pretty limited. And so I'd go back to, you know, the slide that had the different profiles, right, that we talked about here. I'll pull back up really quickly. You've got a group of people that fall into very, very different categories. And I think finding ways to make sure that you're presenting content, focusing your efforts on those folks that are probably more, you know, the halfway point or more on the left side of this, and maximizing, because that's a pretty big part of the population, approximately 50%, 45% of the population. And actually, if you add the issues aware in, that's 67, 68% of the population is at least aware of what's going on. And so, you know, tapping into that group and making sure that they can access the information and being transparent about the same kinds of data sets that you're looking at and allowing them to leverage that, I think, becomes really important.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you. I think that'll about do us for now. I think I've drilled enough questions at you for one day. So Nick Bowden, thank you for joining us today. Much appreciated. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we will see everyone next time. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.